different eyes. I'm pouring out my love over all of you, my people. By the heart of the Father, you will know unity. Let his arms wrap around you, and true repentance fill your heart. Recognize the deeds of the days that have gone by, and you will know forgiveness from the people of this land. Broken walls that are smashed by love, broken walls that'll never stand. They're coming down by hands of love, by the love of God in the hearts of man. We are here, 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 yeah, we are here, we are
Hello, I'm Charles Naismith, one of the many volunteers on the planning committee for this webinar series. I'm a member of Bilberry Creek Baptist Church. We welcome you to our Walking Together conference, and we really are very thankful that you can join us. We are hosting our presentations from Canada, west of Ottawa, and Orleans, east of Ottawa, here in Ontario. I would like to begin our time together by acknowledging that the land on which we are virtually gathering has been walked on before. It is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg People. On behalf of all who are here, I offer our gratitude regarding their care for and their teachings about our earth and our relations. And we pray that this evening's presentation will honor these teachings. Now it is my privilege to reintroduce the hosts for our series. Sarah Beardy lives in Peterborough, Ontario, and is the mother of 5 children. She is the daughter of Levi and Viola Beardy. She is proud of her Oji-Cree heritage. She belongs to the Wolf clan and has descended from her family's traditional lands in Bearskin Lake, Big Trout Lake in northwestern Ontario, and beautiful Newfoundland. Sarah and her family are members of the Selwyn Outreach Center in Peterborough, Ontario. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Charles.
Jonathan Miracle is Mohawk from Ontario. He resides on Tyendinaga, Mohawk territory, along with his wife Linda and 4 children. Jonathan is the son of Andrew C. Miracle Sr. and Lillian Miracle, and was born in Akwesasne, Mohawk territory. Importantly, Jonathan is the founder of Broken Walls, which is an internationally recognized First Nations musical group and ministry. He has traveled the world for the past 25 years with this group, seeking to have people from cultural minorities restored and able to walk together as partners in destiny within the body of Christ. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. Sego Skanagoa. I greet you today. How is your spirit?
As the hosts of this gathering, we are able to see who is attending, but we know that you as the audience cannot. We would like you all to be able to get a sense of the community that has gathered together, and it is broad and it reaches far. We invite each of you to please send us a short note by using the Q&A question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. Let us know your name and where you live. If you know it, also tell us whose Indigenous traditional territory you live on. And if you don't know, and we think you should, here's a link to the website to help you find it later. native-land.ca or native-land.ca, or even more simply, native space land, and Google it. As you think about questions that you would like us to ask Professor Burrows this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where you are, please feel free to send them in. So Sarah, I'm now going to turn this over to you. So where are we at in this Walking Together series?
Thanks, Charles. This will be our fourth presentation. We gave it the same name as the overall theme of the whole conference series, that we are all treaty people. So first we had Reverend Dr. Cheryl Bear. She started us out and talked about the land and how the identity of Indigenous people was bound up in their relationship to the land. In week 2, Professor Alan Corbière told us about the events that led up to the making of an early agreement called the 1764 Treaty of Niagara, which opened the door to European settlement in Canada. He said that long ago, for a short while, we walked well together on a good path, a pathway based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. And last week, Grand Chief Dr. Matthew Cunningham told us about Canada's first modern treaty. He said that the James Bay Agreement was bringing encouragement and prosperity, not just to the Cree people of Iou-Istichi, but all the people of Quebec. As he talked, he described a nation-to-nation relationship based on respect, cooperation, and partnership. He made it sound a lot like the ancient pathway that Alan Corbière had described. So that's where we're at so far in our series. So I'm excited for our next presentation.
Thanks, Sarah, for bringing us up to date tonight. Professor John Burrows is this evening's presenter. He's thought deeply about the principles embedded in early Indigenous law. He's given special attention to the 1763 Royal Proclamation and in the 1764 Treaty of Niagara. In his recent book, The Right Relationship, that would be this book, Professor Burrows brought together a whole team of Indigenous legal scholars. They have given intellectual form to what Canada might look like if we were willing to walk together along the same ancient pathway we started out back in 1764. If you look on the cover of this book, you can see a picture of the two wampum belts that I have right here in my studio. We will learn a little about them tonight, a little more about them tonight. And I will introduce the guest speaker in just a minute, but first, I have a song that I'd like to play for you. A song about the beauty that I see when I look out, because as a musician, I'm always looking and as I write songs, I'm always looking to see what's coming next. And I see the beauty in the people that just needs to bud like a flower. And right now, it's not budding yet, but through the work of like John Burrows and through the work of Matthew Cunningham and Alan Corbière and the Jim and Sarah and the ones that they're putting together, we're doing our best to help to unlock these doors. So this is a song called I See Beauty. We all have a purpose. Each one plays a part. Path that you walk on, oh let it be the right one. I see beauty when I'm with you, the gifts that you share and the color of your skin. As we give of ourselves, we make life so much sweeter and the world a better place to live. place to live. We celebrate the fall of the wall and the joy of coming together. We see the hope of how things could be and the change when we're together. The change when we're together. Respond with your gifts as a matter of your heart. One step at a time. It's a good place to start. I see beauty when I'm with you. Gifts that you share in the color of your skin. As we give of ourselves, we make life so much sweeter and the world a better place to live. Through honor, a better place to live. We celebrate the fall of the wall and the joy of coming together. We see the hope of how things could be and the change when we're together. The change when we're together. Respond with your gifts as a matter of your heart. One step at a time. It's a good place to start. I see beauty when I'm with you. Gifts that you share and the color of your skin. As we give of ourselves, we make life so much sweeter and through honor, a better place to live. Yes, through honor, a better place to live. Through honor, a better place to live. So Professor Burrows is an Anishinaabe Ojibwe and a member of the Chippewa of the Nawish First Nation in Ontario. He's a law professor and the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria Law School. One thing I noticed when I looked on John's bio was that he started the Indigenous Peoples Legal Clinic on Vancouver's East Side. And if anybody knows about Vancouver's East Side, some of that neighborhood is the most impoverished neighborhood area in all of the country. And I had a friend who has recently passed away there named Randy Barnettson, and he started a church in that area, a street church, and fed perhaps 2 million people over the years that he was there. And so I just want to say, you know, John is doing work there in a legal way, and my friend was there because that's a place where our First Nations people go. And I asked one of the guys on the street, I said, why do you come here? Why are you sitting here on the ground in the street here? He said, I came here to die. And I mean, that's the terrible situation that is being faced. But, you know, because of people like John and the different ones we've had, we want to see that change, and we want to see Canada become proud of its Indigenous people. So John specializes in Indigenous legal rights and comparative constitutional law. He has written and spoken extensively on Indigenous legal rights and traditions, storytelling, treaties and land claims, and constitutional and environmental law. His publications have won many awards and include the following titles: Recovering Canada, The Resurgence of Indigenous Law, Canada's Indigenous Constitution, Drawing Out Law, A Spirit's Guide, Freedom and Indigenous Constitutionalism, The Right Relationship, which is the book that I have, Resurgence and Reconciliation, and Laws, Indigenous Ethics. Professor Burrows, John, we're looking forward to your presentation. What an honor it is to have you speak to us this evening.
It's great to be here.
2 weeks ago, Professor Alan Corbier gave us an outline of the events that led up to the 1764 Treaty of Niagara. He explained that treaty operationalized the Royal Proclamation of 1763, but he didn't tell us about the content of the Royal Proclamation or explain how its eventual acceptance makes us all treaty people. We want to hear you speak on this subject. But before you begin in earnest, would you tell us a little bit about your own journey? You didn't start out as a law professor. What put it into your mind to study as hard as you have done? Why law? Why Indigenous law? Why? How? What is it that shaped your heart? We want to know.
I think a big part of it is my mother and father. They have a huge love for me and for the land. And my ancestors, as I'll talk about, signed treaties in Ontario. And so we had all those stories about what they meant to us and what we hoped they meant to others. And that love of the land that's a part of the treaty is something that I wanted to see continued. And so I'm trying to follow my mom and dad and my ancestors, and also honor the land that we live on.
Awesome. So, John, you feel free to speak as fully as you wish and tell us a little more about that, but also go into, tell the story of the 1764 Treaty of Niagara, and feel free to just elaborate.
Okay. Miigwech buju nindinwe maganidok, nij Anishinaabeg, nij marazig, bangi etigo ninata Anishinabem, nguguji juindishnamayan, giganos nindijnakas, neashi unigaming and donjaba, nigigandodem. I'm humbled to be with you this evening. I'm really grateful for this invitation. I hope that as we participate with one another, that we'll have the Spirit to be with us, to guide us and direct us in the way that we talk with one another and consider those things that are precious and beautiful. I want to share a little bit of a journey that I've been on in relationship to treaties, and I'm going to share my screen here and think about some of these words that are a part of our life and actions that are a part of our life through this treaty process. I really love the title of this whole seminar, Walking Together. The word for father in Anishinaabe is no say. The word to walk is bimo say. This idea of ose. Someone once explained to me what a father is, which is one that walks through the snow, making it easier for those that come behind to be able to follow. And there's different ways that we can walk together. We can walk side by side as we want to do, Indigenous and non-Indigenous through the world. But sometimes we need some people to be able to break paths for us, break ground. And I'm grateful that we have this teaching as Anishinaabe people. And as a father myself, I'm grateful to think about the idea of walking as how we might relate to one another. When I introduced myself, I said Nigigan Dodem. So I'm of the Otter clan, and I'm grateful to have that connection. When my great-great-grandfather signed a treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land in Ontario, he put his little otter Dodem, or otter figure, on that treaty. And so that's my relationship to our community. You can see here's another treaty that was made with Washington and Anishinaabe people living in Minnesota. All these clans with hearts joined together, then circulating through our chief here and then being sent off to Washington. This notion of being joined as in our hearts and in our minds is something that's very powerful and important for Anishinaabe people when we do our work and when we try to think about communicating with others. I'm from this land, Neashi Winigaming, Neashi Winigaming and Donjaba. This is the Cape Croker Indian Reserve. It's on the shores of the Saugeen or Bruce Peninsula in Ontario. My reserve there is about 3,000 people, and we've been there from time of memory. Here's another picture of it. The reserve is in this area, just north of Owen Sound and Wyerton, which is about 3 hours north of Toronto and maybe about 4.5 hours north of Detroit. We have sister communities, Chippewa, the Saugeen here around Southampton, Ontario. And then we have some hunting reserves up in what is now the Bruce Peninsula National Park. And so this is our traditional territory, the area where my great-great-grandfather entered into a treaty dealing with this land from Goderich to Arthur, and then from Arthur to Collingwood, and then everything north of that area. I mentioned my name, Giganos in Indigenous. Gigado is the word for speak in Anishinaabemowin, or Ojibwe or Chippewa. Gigadons is the diminutive of. And so there was this function historically when there was a council, someone would be called upon to be able to remember what was said and then to repeat what was said to those that subsequently needed to learn about it. And so this was my name of my great-great-grandfather, Gigadons, and it's the name that I also carry. This is his brother-in-law, Tecumseh. Tecumseh means to walk across. And if you know anything about Tecumseh, he walked across the continent on the eastern part of the seaboard, trying to bring people together to understand that we could live in unity and find ways to be able to honor the traditions that Indigenous peoples had, as well as the British Crown. And so he became an ally of the British Crown in that way. And so that's my ancestry. Nigigan Doden, Otter Clan, Neashi, Udingaming and Donjaba, the Cape Coker Indian Reserve, and then Giganos, Indigenous. This is my great-great-grandfather. He's the person that entered into the treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land. And you can see he has a couple of medals around his neck. One of those medals is from Queen Victoria for having entered into the treaty with the Crown. Another medal is when the surveyors came into the territory around Markdale, Ontario. One of those surveyors got very ill and very sick and had difficulty getting out of the bush. And so he loaded him onto the sleigh and it took him down to York, which is now Toronto, and rescued him. And as a result, received that medal for coming to the aid of those that were settling amongst us. You can see here that he's dressed in a Métis type of an outfit. That's because he was married to this woman who stories are in this book, Margaret MacLeod. Margaret MacLeod is my great-great-grandmother, and Margaret's mother was Teresa Riel, and her father was Joseph MacLeod. And so she dressed here, Peter, my great-great-grandfather, and had that Métis ancestry come into our family as a result. The stories that she recorded are beautiful stories that talk about how we can relate to one another with the earth and are just important, as important for the treaty as is the little marking on the document, because it's those stories that teach us how we should live together as treaty people in the territories that we're a part of. You can see there that this is a Wesleyan missionary notice. In fact, my great-great-great-grandfather converted to Methodism in about 1811, 1812 in an area just north of what's called Shelburne, Ontario now, along the Grand River. And when he was there, he was recorded for the words that he spoke at that time. And fortunately, we have his speech. He says, "Brothers, I've listened to your words. I believe what you say. I will take your advice and worship with you in the Christian religion. Brothers, I thank you for telling me the words of the Great Spirit. I will be Christian. It may be that I will stretch out my hands to the Great Spirit for the blessings which my Christian brothers enjoy. I may receive a handful before I die. Brothers, becoming a Christian, I shall desire to see my children read the good book. As for myself, I am too old to learn, and if I can only hear what my children read, I shall be satisfied with what I hear from them. And then, brothers and sisters, whilst I was in my own country, I heard what the Great Spirit had done for you. So I came to see for myself what this all meant. I have opened my ears to the words spoken by your minister, and what I heard by the hearing of the ear, I now see with mine own eyes. Brothers and sisters, the Great Spirit has planted a tree at this place whose top reaches to the skies. You have found this place and are climbing up towards the abode of the Great Spirit. The place that he visited was the Mississauga of the New Credit at the mouth of the New Credit River in what is now Toronto. And he learned about Christianity from a missionary, Peter Jones, who was Methodist, which is why my great-great-grandfather took on the name Peter Giganos Jones in recognition of that beautiful teaching. I'm grateful for this ancestry, and it shows that we have been able to walk together sometimes as brothers and sisters in Christ, looking for ways to be able to live that advance the love that we're all called upon to share. But as he did that through his life, he also maintained all the goodness that he found was a part of his own Anishinaabe tradition, and that's what he tried to pass on to us as his family. This is my great-grandfather, Charles Giganos Jones, a very wonderful man and the person that was the most loving in my mother's own life as a male figure. And he was a elected chief of the Indian Act, the last hereditary chief or a member of council for 50 years, and did a lot to try to bring that treaty vision to pass. He was a runner. He could run from Detroit to Toronto in about 8 days, and he could run from Toronto to our reserve there up on the Bruce Peninsula in about 4 days. He was able to do that because of the things that his mother taught him. Being a medicine woman, Margaret MacLeod let him know what kind of plants would be necessary to heal, and of course to be able to sustain yourself as you're out around and in the world. This is my grandfather, Josh Jones, and my sister, and this is where I remember him sitting outside of his and his wife's home, teaching us about the treaties and teaching us about the beauty of the land and what it has to be able to offer us and teach us about the Great Spirit and about who we are as humans and the journey that we are on as we try to walk with one another together. This is my mother, Kim, and this is me coming into the world as a little guy. And so taking you through these 7 generations, there's this connection that we have to these teachings and this beauty. This is my daughter. She's a jingle dress dancer. She's also a lawyer. She's married. We have a beautiful little granddaughter that I was able to spend this summer with. And I'm grateful to be able to know that these generations can go on through time. The point I'm making here is that the knowledge that was passed on to me by Giganos through all of these family history lines is something that continues to live in our communities today. And this is where I learned the stories of the treaties and the stories of our relationships with one another and with the Great Spirit. These are the documents that contain many of the promises that were made to us in these treaty events. Alan Corbier talked with you about these last week, and you can see the Turo Wampum as the Haudenosaunee talk about the Guswentah. It's there behind Jonathan as well. These agreements to live together in peace and friendship and respect as represented by the white rose. But then we sail on our rivers of life with a measure of nation-to-nation relationship there with the Crown and its ship of state controlling its affairs, and Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and other peoples in their canoe controlling their affairs. You see this is recognized here by people joining hands together, literally walking together as they go down this path of life with the peace and friendship and respect. Their hearts are visible so that when they do this work together, they bring their whole heart to this. I'm sure Alan talked to you about the 1764 meeting where over 2,000 people gathered representing 24 different nations. And the idea is that if anyone needed help along this path, as Indigenous peoples, all we had to do was pull on the person next to us and the British would come along and come to our aid. Likewise, if the British needed any aid, all they had to do was pull on that and then we would come across and provide aid and assistance for them. This mutuality is a part of the treaty agreement as we work together to try to share with one another. That hand there that's joined to the boat was initially rope. And as you know, rope can fray, it can easily break. And so they then made it into iron. But then you know iron can rust. And so they eventually made it into silver. And here's a representation of that silver at the bottom, known as the silver covenant chain. And what is necessary is that you polish that silver. You meet frequently to be able to remember the need so that if there's anything that's tarnishing that relationship, it can be brightened up and made to shine again. These ideas of treaty are a big part of what we learned. And when I was doing my PhD research, this is what I focused on quite strongly, learning from that 7 generations of my ancestry to understand the agreement there. And then I went into the archives. And in going into the archives, I've got a document here of over 40 pages and very small 11-point font. And you can read about what was talked about back and forth across the council fire as people met for 2 months and passed over 84 wampum belts back and forth across the fire. And here's one of the speeches that was given by the representative of the British, Sir William Johnson. He says, "Brothers of the Western nations, sachems, chiefs, and warriors, you have now been here for several days, during which time we have frequently met to renew and strengthen our engagements. And you've made so many promises of your friendship and attachment to the English that it now remains for us only to exchange this great belt of the covenant chain, that we may not forget our mutual promises." And then it goes on to talk about those promises, the promise of being tied together, as I just mentioned a second ago, that we would never let that chain, that covenant chain, slip out of our hands, that we wouldn't listen to people that tried to break us from those agreements that we have with one another, that there would be a way that our complaints would be heard with justice, and that we would have this ability to rectify any mistaken prejudices that would come amongst us, so that we would be a happy people. You can see these words are to be implanted in our hearts. And then there's these responses given by the Anishinaabe here, saying that they're well pleased with that, where they were promised, and that these promises they first heard at Michilimackinac, and they're pleased to hear them renewed at Niagara. And they also heard these resolutions of the king, which is the royal proclamation, which I'll talk about in a moment, and how this idea of holding fast to the covenant chain is an idea of holding fast to friendship. Here's a report of upwards of 2,000 people gathering. All the different nations are mentioned, including of the Western nation, and how the people are meant to be able to share. If we had time, and we don't, I could just take you through chapter after chapter and word after word of these promises as they were passed back and forth across that council place in that moment. It's a beautiful thing to know that what we founded our nation on is love, is a love of one another, of trying to find ways to knit our hearts together. One of the metaphors that was shared is that if lightning was to come and strike these people so that their arms would be taken off, they would immediately turn around and they would join their other arms. And they said they would do that because of the love that they wanted to share for one another. Love was mentioned quite prominently in these engagements. As we think about this, the royal proclamation was also given at the council fire, or at least spoken about at the council fire. As you saw a second ago, the resolutions of the king were made known. And that royal proclamation said that colonial governments were forbidden from taking Indian land, that land was to be reserved to us, that we were not to be molested and disturbed in possession of our ancient territories. It was also forbidden for individual non-native people to come up and take land. The idea of squatting on land and gaining land by preemption, by just living there, was also forbidden by this royal proclamation. And then there was a treaty process that was proposed there, which said that if land was to be given to settlers by Indigenous peoples, that it would be by the more distant government, the government in the right of Westminster, of Great Britain, on the part of the Crown. That is, local governments were forbidden from taking Indian land, so that there was this check and balance. If local governments were the ones that were allowed to take up Indian land, they have the greatest incentives to perhaps undermine the occupation of Indigenous peoples. And so by having the more distant party have that authority, that is the Sir William Johnson, who was appointed by the king, that was meant to ensure that there would not be this dispossession by locals who might want to get their hands on land that just lay next door to them. This joins to the Treaty of Niagara, this idea of alliance, this idea of trade, dealing with any criminal justice complaints that we have between ourselves, and then this notion of land being reserved to ourselves. Imagine that way of founding a country through multilingual, that is lots of different languages of these nations, as well as the British, and then multi-jurisdictional, multi-legal, different legal traditions coming together, English and Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and Potawatomi and Abenaki and Sac and Fox and Illini and Odawa and Cree, right? The idea of the nation being formed by coming to agreement, trying to persuade one another and using indigenous forms and indigenous law is something that's a wonderful thing. And it comes on the heels of war after 7 years of war between the French and the English, as I'm sure Alan talked with you about last week. They could have continued the war after the French was defeated. The British could have continued the war after defeating the French, but instead they sat down with the peace pipe, they sat down with wampum, and they said, we're not going to pursue that way of coercion, that way of force. We're going to pursue that way of peace, which is as outlined here with the proclamation and the treaty, but it's also much more than that because it brings in Anishinaabe law, Haudenosaunee law. It brings in all those metaphors that are a part of our legal traditions along the way. And I want to share with you what one of those legal traditions is. This is a modern day constitution from the Amjwanong Nation, which is the Chippewa of the Sarnia on Lake St. Clair, on the St. Clair, actually just at the mouth of the St. Clair River. And you can see that what they're putting in their constitution, Ningodwe Wangizet Anishinaabe, one Anishinaabe family. Banjagade, Gisan, Anishinaabe, King, Dibit Diguan, Gadne, Manadu, Wadizuin. Creator placed the Anishinaabe on the earth along with the gift of spirituality. This is in the opening clauses of our constitutions. Shkode, Nibit, Akit, Noden, Gibit Gosanon, we Nagadawain Damang, Mam, Pishi Kamikong. Here on Mother Earth, there were gifts given to the Anishinaabe to look after fire, water, earth, and wind. Banjagade, Gimi, Nan, Gechua, Wayne, Dagog, Nishnabeng, Wa, Najnu, Jin, Ninda, Nishwaswe, Kinu, Madwinan. The Creator also gave the Anishinaabe 7 sacred gifts to guide them. They are Zigidawin, Debwewin, Manan Dane Dumawin, Nabwakawan, Daba Dane Dizuwin, Weakwadizuwin, Minua Akadewin. Love, truth, respect, wisdom, humility, honesty, and bravery. The point that is being made here is that people are writing these into the contemporary constitutions that they're promulgating around the province. But when they're writing their constitutions, they're referencing those ancient laws that they're trying to make a part of the present to be able to guide us into the future. And when Anishinaabe and other people signed treaties with the Crown, we came with our law. And we wanted to share our law with those that would settle amongst us. And we invited those that were settling in amongst us to learn those laws that are around them, those laws that come from the Creator, those laws that come from the fire and the water and the earth and the wind, those laws that are found in the natural world around us. And so that's what I want to just develop with you a minute here. So you'll notice this is again a representation of our territory, the Saugeen Anishinaabe. We've got all these different rivers here, the Maitland River and the Saugeen River and the Nottawasaga River and others. But what happens with these rivers is that they gather nutrients for hundreds of miles, and through these little tributaries, these nutrients accumulate, and then they keep growing in their flow until eventually they come to this huge mouth of the river. This is at Southampton. This would have been a place of rich diversity before all these navigational aids were put in to block the flow. Because what happens is at the river mouth, this is what we call Saugeen. Saugeen is the great river mouth. It's that place where all those nutrients are delivered in a defined channel to create a rich diversity of life. Because of all of that flow, you get all those microbes that will be in this river. And with those microbes, you'll get lots of different fish that will swim in there and munch on those and make a meal of that, and of all these plants that will grow in this place because of that delivery of all that nutrient that comes off the land for hundreds of kilometers. And with those plants and those microbes and those fish, you get all sorts of birds moving into the territory. And with those birds being there in rich abundance, of course, then you get animals coming into that territory. With all that wildlife, then that's where the Anishinaabe would settle in the summer seasons usually. at the mouth of these rivers. And so we're the Algonquin Anishinaabeg because we're at the mouth of this river. But the point I want to make to you is to go back here a second and look at our word for love, Zagidwin. So how do you learn about love? You look to the river, and the river teaches you about what love might look like in action, which is, as human beings, we should try to accumulate all of this nourishment that can flow into us by the relationships that we have. And we should try to find a way to deliver that in a defined channel. And by so doing, create this richness, diversity of life that allows for others to be able to sustain themselves in all that kind of variety that we might find around us. This idea of Zagin is related to this idea of Zagidawin. When you see a river, you see an idea of how to love. And here's my great-grandfather again. My mother said he was the embodiment of a river, the way that his life flowed and the way that he was able to pass along to others the goodness that he felt enabled others to be able to accumulate so much of power and opportunity in their parts of the world. It's often said in our treaties that they're to be for as long as the river flows. That's beautiful poetic language that indicates the time depth of these promises, how long they should last with one another. But it also talks about more than just time depth in poetry, because Indigenous peoples learn about law from the land and from the waters, and they'll analogize that to their behavior, or as the case might be, that it might distinguish some of the things that are happening on the land and the natural environment and not want to live in that way. If I think about Zagin, I'm talking about a river. If I talk about Zagit, I'm talking about love. If I talk about Zagate, that's the sun that shines upon me, Zagate. If I talk about the buds coming out of the soil, that's actually Zagibaga. Zagibaga, Zagate, Zagin. Love is found in the energy of the river. That is, love is illustrated there. Love is found as the leaves open up. Imagine yourself opening your receptors to God, to others, and having all of that nourishment photosynthesize you and grow the possibility of providing fruit for others to be able to live with, or putting your face up to the sun in a day when you need strength and courage, and just feeling that warmth upon your face. That's the kind of encouragement that the treaty brings to us, is for settlers to come and live amongst us and learn about the land and how it teaches us about love. It teaches us, and then there's all of these other words in our Constitution that are related to the natural world around us: truth and respect and wisdom and humility and honesty and bravery. The idea here is that if treaties are created nation to nation, and they're by different laws coming together with one another, these are now parts of the law of Canada, parts of the laws that surround us. And of course, they connect with what my great-great-grandfather was saying when he heard Methodists teach about the Bible and teach about Jesus Christ, and the necessity of finding ways to live with love and to live in harmony with one another, and appreciate and respect and draw out the beauty of the world that surrounds us. You know, when Jesus was on the earth, he always was teaching in parables, and he was directing our attention to, consider the lilies of the field, how they toil not, neither do they spin. Yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like unto one of these. Or the little sparrow that he sees fall. He talked about water so significantly as a force of renewal through baptism and through the power of the sacraments that we take with communion. That is, there's so much of that teaching that's found in the Bible that's also found in the natural world around us, that is a part of some of these treaty relationships. Well, this idea of having the Crown in right of Great Britain be the partner into which we have this treaty relationship eventually came into domesticated context. Here, section 9124 of the Constitution says The exclusive legislative authority of the Parliament of Canada extends to all matters coming within the classes of subjects next year after enumerated, that is to say, Indians and lands reserved for Indians. So when our Constitution was set up in 1867, there was a section here that said the arrangements for Indians dealing with others is to be through the more distant government, the federal government here, the Parliament of Canada, not the local governments, not the provinces. That's what was put into the proclamation to make sure that people would not molest us or disturb us, because there's a kind of an incentive that those people have that are close at hand to want to take our land. And by putting the relationship with that more distant party, it was meant to try to preserve those earlier ways of being. But what eventually happened is you have cases that take place through the 1880s up into the 1970s that no longer regard Indian reserves as being that more distant power. And there's an attempt through something called Section 88 of the Indian Act to make all laws of general application from time to time in force in the province applicable to in respect of Indians. So what happened is our treaty relationship kind of migrated from the British Crown in England to Ottawa. And then here what happened is then it gets put further into provincial hands. And that's been a challenge for many Indigenous peoples. But fortunately, we have this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that say Indigenous peoples have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements with the states. And I think that's what's being attempted to be implemented when people talk about legislation to get this point across. When treaties are interpreted, the court has developed all these special rules of interpretation. They say these agreements are a unique type of agreement and attract special principles of interpretation. They should be liberally construed, and ambiguities or doubtful expressions resolved in favor of the Aboriginal signatories. That the goal of this treaty interpretation is to choose from among the various possible interests that which would advance the common interests of the parties, which best reconciles them at the time the treaty was signed. The honor and integrity of the Crown should always be part of these agreements. That there should be a sensitivity to the unique cultural and linguistic differences between the parties. That you would understand these treaties as they would be naturally understood by the parties at the time. And what I'm saying is my great-great-grandfather, when he entered into this treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres, he understood about Christianity, he understood about love, but he also understood from his own tradition that you learn about love from the natural world around you. And so we try to invite people into that relationship, to love one another, to love the animals, the plants, the rivers, and to share in that space, to avoid a technical or contractual interpretation of the treaties, and to do so in a way that's realistic. So why treaties? Well, they're better than the alternatives, right? We're not building our country on the notion of doctrine of discovery, as if there was no one here prior to the arrival of Europeans, or the people that were here were inferior to Europeans, right? Or this notion of occupation without the participation of Indigenous peoples, or adverse possession or conquest, right? We could choose to build our country on these ideas: conquest, adverse possession, the doctrine of discovery, right? And that's the path of force. That's the path of coercion. That's the path that assumes some people are inferior to other people. It assumes Indigenous peoples are inferior to the Crown because they don't have enough governance, they don't have enough land, such that their land and governance power is equivalent to the Crown when they first meet, right? And so for a long time in our history, we've tried to construct our relations on discovery, occupation, adverse possession, and conquest. But we know early on, we have this treaty alternative, which was an alternative dealing with reconciliation. It's about the consent of the parties. It's about their ongoing recognition, right? Shining the covenant chain, delineating the relationships that would be there on the land, protecting the waters, protecting the animals, protecting one another from harm. This is a beautiful alternative. If we have choice, which we do, as to how we think about Canada being founded, we can go down that path: discovery, occupation, adverse possession, conquest, which we tried to do from about 1870 to about 1970, 80, Or we can put this more firmly on our way of proceeding. This is the idea that treaties reserve rights to the Indians, right? Treaties are grant of rights from the Indians, not to the Indians. That is, the settlers have what they have in the different territories that we're all a part of, because people like my great-great-grandfather agreed and granted rights to others to be in this area. And so as beneficiaries of the treaties, of course, Indigenous peoples are beneficiaries as they reserve those rights that they had prior to the arrival of Europeans, but all other Canadians also become beneficiaries of the treaties, right? They are, as much as my own nation, the Chippewa of the Nawash, other people can trace their invitation to be here, their rights to be here through those agreements. These treaties bridge legal systems, right? They recognize Indigenous legal systems, they recognize the common law legal systems, and what they do is they create intersocietal law. That is law that blends the standards and principles from both the common law and the Indigenous law world. When our courts deal with this, I showed you those principles of treaty interpretation a second ago, and you can see on Jonathan's belt there behind you, this idea of people linking arms together, or those white rows of peace and friendship and respect. The court said a morally and politically defensible conception of these rights will incorporate both legal perspectives. Right? We don't have a morally and politically defensible conception of Aboriginal or treaty rights unless we also try to see Indigenous law as the standards, principles, and criteria by which we govern ourselves in this land and relate to one another, right? Law is functional. Law is a standard, principle, criteria, precedent, authority, guidepost, signpost, regulation, resource for regulating our affairs and resolving our disputes. Treaties are therefore about the future. For as long as the grass grows, the river flows, and the sun shines, they are about nation building, right? Sometimes people might say, why would you want to pay attention to something like the Treaty of Niagara that's 250 years old? Well, I might say to you, the Gospel of Matthew is thousands of years old, or the Constitution of the United States is a couple of hundred years old, and that we give great place for those old things because those old things can speak to us in the present and help to guide us in the future. And so when we think about treaties in this way, they create processes for our future together, guided by the natural world and what surrounds us after that fashion. I'm grateful for this time that I have to be with you. I'm so appreciative of all the speakers that preceded me. I really admire their work. I've looked up to them for so long. I'm also grateful just to be in your presence and have this invitation to spend time with you, and now to be able to answer a few questions as we go along. First, I think a bit of a curated discussion with my hosts here, and then something that's perhaps more open-ended as we come through our time together. But thank you, Miigwech Bizinduign you. I look forward to continuing this next little while and further delving into these issues.
Thank you so much. I just love being reminded of how much Indigenous understanding comes from the natural laws, and not looking like nature is wild, right? And it has order, and you can learn from order, and you get wisdom, and you these life lessons, these seven grandfathers, or the natural laws that you've mentioned, of love and bravery and respect and humility. Yeah, no, I love bringing that into this. It's the first time that's really been brought in, and I really thank you for that.
No, Miigwech, thank you.
I do want to have a question here, though. In respect to the Indigenous peoples on the West Coast, who wouldn't have been invited to attend the 1764 meeting at Fort Niagara, are the principles of the Royal Proclamation applicable all across the whole country, or only in the homelands of the original signatories?
That's a great question. And there's a couple of different answers. For a long time, people in British Columbia, that is the government of British Columbia, didn't regard the Royal Proclamation as applying to this territory. So treaties were signed throughout Ontario and across the prairies and into the Northwest Territories and Yukon, but not so much here in this province, because the Royal Proclamation talked about geographic territories, and the people here said the geography that's mentioned in the Royal Proclamation doesn't mention British Columbia. But there's another interpretation. It's the interpretation that the Supreme Court of Canada adopted in 1973 in a case called the Queen versus Calder, that said wherever the British flag goes, the principles of the Royal Proclamation follow. They said the Royal Proclamation is the Indian Magna Carta. And the point there is that wherever the British go, those principles follow them, which is to recognize those lands are reserved to Indians until such time as they agree to share them with others in this kind of public setting. It's now the case that treaties are being negotiated out here in British Columbia, but that second alternative, that idea that the Royal Proclamation follows the flag of England, was slow to arrive here in this part of the world.
Thank you.
This is pretty exciting to hear how you said that love is a foundation, because I can remember I was in a large gathering where the church was involved. The church was hosting the gathering, but the gathering was, there was a lot of traditional people there, non-Christian people, and they had the leadership of the evening in the church. And I can remember, it just strikes me when how you brought how love is a foundational part of all this, because the chief stood up, and he was from South Dakota, and he said, he said, I've never been a Christian, but he said, why do Christians think they're the only ones who know what love is? He said, we've known what love is all of our lives. It's all a part. And he talked about their horses, and he talked about the land, and he talked about the things that teach him about what true love really is. And it so impacted me. Like, I was so moved by the way he brought that out. And then he said, is it okay for me to pray? Because as a Lakota, he wanted to pray, and he actually asked, he was cool enough to ask for permission, which was really crazy. And I was like really, really passionate at the moment. I stood up and I said, please pray. It was really crazy. But so when you said this, so we can trace love back. These treaties were made in a sense of character and a sense of promise and a sense of love. And I don't know, you're blowing my mind here, John. This is really cool stuff.
One of the things, when you look at the names on the land, you can learn about these ideas of love. So the word Mississauga is that word Zaga again, Mississauga. It's the great river mouth, but it's also teaching about love. Or you look at Spadina Avenue in Toronto, Ishpadana, which means it goes up, but you look up. It's related to Ishpeming, which is heaven. The Umimika is the doves, the place where the doves sing. Ottawa is the place where people gather to trade, and you can't have trade unless you have good relations. Right? There's just so much of that just written on the land from coast to coast.
Yeah, in the Mohawk language, it's Ganaronkwa, or Ganaronkwa means love and medicine. Medicine and love meaning coming from the same word. That makes so much sense.
Yes,
yeah,
beautiful.
Really beautiful. So I have a question here for you. The New Zealand Parliament and courts have used the Treaty of Waitangi, a treaty made in 1840 between the Crown and the Indigenous people in that country, to resolve grievances, to restore the well-being of the Maori societies, and reconcile Maori communities with the state and other parts of society. Is the Royal Proclamation able to function the same way in Canada today?
So the Treaty of Waitangi is a beautiful document. It's written in both Maori and English. and you work out the meaning of the agreement between the languages, right? You can't just take the English as the official word or the Maori as the official word. It's how they triangulate together. And of course, that document there, that treaty, covers the entire country of New Zealand. The question is whether or not the Royal Proclamation also covers the entire country of Canada. Well, the geography mentioned in the document might not, but the principles that are within the document do. And so then the question becomes, how do you implement that? What I've really appreciated, I've been to New Zealand a few times and taught there for 6 months or whatnot, is people use Maori law and Maori ways to be able to, in effect, a reconciliation in a contemporary setting. And so if there's a dispute, what will happen is people will study the dispute, historians and anthropologists and elders and lawyers. But once they create the document, what's happened is people are invited to the marae, which is like the reserve. And when they come to the marae to try to solve this dispute, you have one of those hakas where people are challenged, in that dance that you might see with the New Zealand All Blacks, saying to the crown, what is your intention in coming here? And if the crown is prepared, they'll do a haka back, which is amazing, right? To think that the crown would pick up indigenous ways of expressing their intentions. And then once that haka occurs, then the women will sing a waiata and welcome people onto the marae to deal with that question that's unresolved. And then once they're on the marae, they'll eat with one another. They'll feast together. And feasting together, they're rubbing shoulders, they're breaking bread, they're getting to know who those visitors are that are coming to make these decisions. And then after they've done that, then they go into the building of the marae itself, and they have work that occurs both in Maori and in English with elders and judges just interacting together to bring forward their views. And I would love to see that happen in Canada. And I once asked the chair of the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal, Eddie Jury, how did you get this? How did you figure out this innovation? And he said, well, I was a young man in Canada in the early 1970s, and I was up in the Mackenzie Delta, and there was something called the Berger Inquiry, and there things were on the land in accordance with traditions of the people, and that's how that inquiry was framed. And I said, are you kidding me? We had that in Canada, and then you picked it up, and we're not doing that in quite the same way that we could. And so the point is that what's happening with Waitangi could definitely happen in the Canadian context, and we have a lot to learn back and forth across the ocean that way.
That makes me think about the thing that I've seen happening here is the thing called the blanket exercise. Have you ever seen that?
I have.
And how it by the time a group of people come to it, and some of them attend it, not so really well aware of what they're coming to, but when they actually put themselves in the shoes of the people and go through this blanket exercise, they come out with a far greater understanding. I mean, I've done it with hundreds of people and seen people just crying and asking questions and, wanting to reconcile right on the spot. But, the love is there. And, I would say anybody out there, if you have never attended a blanket exercise, that's a good place to get warmed up for the things that we're talking about here. But yeah, the Maori and having, I like that, I made a note of that, how the cultures interact between each other. And it's not all one culture dominating the issue. It's both cultures give and take, and that's where the beauty and the love and the brotherhood happens. And that's what we're trying to do with Walking Together. We're trying to reach that place of brotherhood in Canada where, we can, like the song I sang was about the gifts, and I really respond to your gifts. And John, you've responded to your gifts, and you're bringing, like, I just feel like I'm hyper learning here as you're sharing, and I'm just growing and giving me a lot of fodder for music. And I'm just thinking about this, and where is it going to go? You know, like I'm believing that we're going to see some really great things happen in Canada.
I believe that too, and I've been teaching for 28 years now in law schools, and there's so many bright and amazing young people that pick up that hope and they actually live that hope. It's not that they don't struggle, they do. It's not that there's not challenges, they're all over the place. But there's also ways to deal with this that are more intersocietal, that allow us to recognize the goodness that is there in the common law, and also the goodness that's within Indigenous practices and law too.
Wow. So I have a second question here. Can you tell us a little bit about Canada's Modern Treaty Forum? Prime Minister Trudeau heads it up. What's the main point of this forum? What are they trying to do? And what sort of success do you think it'll have?
Yeah, so I think you heard about some of that last week with Dr. Chief Matthew Kuhncom, where what's being created is specificity. So when there's disputes between the parties, you have ways to process those disputes because they've been set out in kind of chapter and verse in a treaty agreement. Whereas without those ways that are set down on paper, you know, people go to blockades or they go to court or they just give up and they feel like it's not worthwhile, they can't engage. But these treaties provide pathways for people to do work in child and family services, forestries, fisheries, health services, education, taxation, business development, governance. You know, some of these treaties have like 37 chapters to them, and each of these chapters has kind of heads of powers that set out how you harmonize the federal, provincial, and First Nations relationship in that particular sphere. And that harmonization is so much more certain than a blockade, than a court case, than kind of someone just going back to their own corner and disengaging, and then all the things that happen when that can occur.
You know, as I grew up, you know, I watched the anger that took place, and I saw how people had to stand up for it. But then fortunately, there are people like you and people who, you know, I write songs, you operate in your forum, and we're all trying to do things to help to bring it to a new place of understanding. Because we can't, the blockades are something that are really difficult to deal with, but sometimes it seems like it's needed, doesn't it?
Yeah, so you do need different pathways if you're not getting people to listen to you. And so it is important to keep all of those things on the agenda, court cases and going back to your own corner and blockades and treaties. But at the end of the day, if you're just relying on blockades, if you're just relying on court cases, they're too blunt of a tool. They're not, they don't provide the specificity that helps you then mingle in ways that are more productive over the long term. So I would say, I believe in peaceful protest. I believe that we need to be able to express ourselves and our anger righteously when that's there. But I don't believe that we should just be funneling people off to those ways of being alone. And we just have better imaginations than that. We have more tools than that. And treaties are one of those very powerful tools. And the fact that they're constitutionalized then means that they're the highest law in the land when we sign land claims agreements or treaties.
What Sarah's up next, but I just want to ask you, is this a book that people would really help people, or is there a book that you think would be user-friendly for that you've written that would be good for people to have?
Yeah, that book is good because it has lots of different authors with different perspectives, sharing how to relate together through the treaty ideas. There are other books that I've written. There's this one recently, this Laws, Indigenous Ethics, and that's a book that talks about the 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings, how they relate to treaties, how they relate to Aboriginal title, and how they relate to education. And then I have this other book called Canada's Indigenous Constitution, which is what it says, is that we have a constitution that's not just from Britain, it's made here in these lands. And so we need to think about how we are constituted and constituting, like the verb of constitute, right? That's part of what I was trying to say in that book. So you can start in any of those places if you're interested in my work.
Wonderful.
Thanks for asking
Pass it
that,
over to
Jonathan. That's a
Sarah.
good question. Yeah, so I have another question here. Alan Corbier told us Canada's early treaties differed from modern treaties in a really striking way, in the sense that early treaties were only 1 page long, whereas modern treaties are a whole bookshelf long. Matthew Kuhncombe backed that observation up. He said that the James Bay Agreement was a very complex document. He said that it changed over time into an extremely detailed and lengthy agreement. You had used the phrase sacredness of nuance. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, love that question. The idea of nuance being sacred is to understand that people receive the possibilities of how they might relate together in different ways. And so that 1 page treaty was really just evidence of an oral agreement. And the oral agreement was in the wampum belts, was in the songs, in the stories, in the language, in the land. And so what's beautiful about those agreements is that they tried to get us to internalize ways of living with one another that would be continually renewed. But now we're not always face to face like they were in those earlier agreements. And so you get these treaties that are like books, as you said, and sometimes they're like shelves of books. And that enables us to, from a distance, administer those principles that we were hoping to internalize in those earlier agreements. I like to suggest that, though, even with these recent agreements, we still have to internalize what's on the page. There are beautiful laws around the world, but if people don't live in accordance with those laws, then they're not worth the paper that they're written on. We sometimes know this as Christians. We have beautiful teachings in the Bible, but if we don't bring them to life through our actions, they don't have power for us. And so it is when we have these agreements, they need to internalize the power that's there, rather than just leaving it to technocrats and bureaucrats and lawyers like myself to try to tease the meaning out of them. We're much better off if we can engage in the spirit of those treaties, the spirit and intent of those treaties, and not just hang on every contractual clause and comma or colon that might be there.
All right. So Sarah, is there a second part to your question, or is that?
You know what? I'll ask. I think you've kind of answered this with really putting up all of your resources already, but it was just that because of last week, all across Canada was Treaty Week, and that Canadians are treaty people, and a lot of people are engaging with this idea now that they hadn't quite realized. Can you suggest any other books or videos that might help interested students begin to explore how we are all beneficiaries of these treaties?
Yeah, Thomas King has an amazing book that's introductory to the area, and he tells it with humor. I think it's called The Inconvenient Indian.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's a very good introduction. And then Bob Joseph has written a book called 21 Things, and they're 21 things that address some of the stereotypes or common questions that we might have in the area. And then I just think it's important to read the individual treaty histories. I've got a colleague, his name is Michael Ash, and he wrote a book on being here to stay. And he talked about the honor of the crown in that book and how Governor Morris really wanted to bring honor to the relationship that he was proposing in the Treaty 4 agreement. And so it sheds some light, not just on Indigenous perspectives there, but also on the Crown's perspective in wanting to live in an uplifting, mutually supportive way, and not just seeing treaties as ways to steal land or, just get the Indians out of the way for the rest of the country to be built. Those are three books that I really appreciate.
Cool. So last week, I think a pointed question came to Alan in regards to the Indian Act. Someone said, well, do we need to get rid of the Indian Act? So a question has come up from our audience saying, understanding the Indian Act should be removed. And if so, what would replace it? And what are your thoughts? What should come first?
So I went through an article, and you can look it up online. It's called 7 Generations, 7 Teachings, Ending the Indian Act. And I think the best way to end the Indian Act is through those 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings. That if we lived with one another within our communities, with respect and love and honesty and wisdom and those ideas, that would end the Indian Act quicker than anything else would, because people would be embracing a way of life that doesn't regard the world as being about assimilation, which the Indian Act is designed to do, is to assimilate Indigenous peoples, get rid of our ways of governing ourselves, our ways of relating to the land. And of course, if we were living by that power and we were having relationships with our neighbors and Wyerton or Owen Sound or Southampton, or if you're in Peterborough, whatever place you happen to be, that would do more to end the Indian Act. And so I'm making the point that Indigenous people's own laws could be very powerful in that regard in ending the Indian Act. But having said that, we could also pass legislation that recognized and affirmed Indigenous people's governance powers and allowed for those kinds of constitutions that I was showing on the screen there to be recognized and affirmed. And if Indigenous peoples adopted their own ways of governance that could be harmonized and correlated with the broader governance schemes, I think that would be the best path forward. And so in Ontario, like I mentioned, there's this Anishinaabeg Nation, which is overarching. There's 43 nations in the Anishinaabeg Nation. First Nations like Wickwemikong or Amjwanong or whatever. So there's that constitution at that level, but then also each community is passing their own constitution. And in doing so, they're basing it on these 7 grandmother-grandfather teachings, basing it on our clan teachings, basing it on these other notions, as well as structures of government, which we're all familiar with.
That's a really, really cool answer. I mean, it's so organic and so real. I mean, for people to coexist, right?
And we don't have to wait for anyone to do that, right? We can start tonight, tomorrow, by loving, by respecting, by being honest. We can try to get others to do that. But then communities themselves can draft those constitutions and express what their oral tradition might be.
History teaches us, yeah.
I see another question here from the audience. If the Treaty of Niagara went so well and everyone came to an understanding, then what happened? For example, the residential schools.
What happened was eventually the Indigenous peoples lost the balance of power in North America. If you could play the French off against the English, or the British North Americans against the United States of America, you could hold a balance of power. And so you still had that sort of ability to be more independent in the way that you related to people around you. But after the War of 1812, when there was a settlement between between the Crown and Right of Great Britain and the United States of America, slowly, through about 50 years, that relationship of equality and respect was moved. And then when you get to the 1860s and 70s, particularly 1880s, you're in a situation where the dominance is running the day. You need to get Indians out of the way. They're regarded as being inferior, so you put them into residential schools or pass an Indian Act to try to school them to be like other people that are around them, that loss of respect occurs because they're not regarded as being as politically as powerful as they were in that prior era. Of course, at home, many of these communities still have those laws, still have those ways of being, but they weren't given the scope that they were prior to 1812. And then, of course, what's happened in the last 40 years is Indigenous political power has grown again, with the civil rights movement in the United States and a quiet revolution in Quebec. Well, Indigenous peoples in Canada started recognizing that there's a space to take up there. They don't want to be discriminated against, like the Quebecois were throwing off in their province, or like African Americans were doing with the Jim Crow laws in the South. And so since the 1960s, you've got that growth of political power again. And so you see Indigenous peoples coming back with some of that more, what was lost in that 100 years and plus after the War of 1812.
I got a really practical question from a listener. Thanks for being here, they said. What do you think is the most effective way for non-Indigenous people to influence the government to move ahead with reconciliation?
I think that really depends on where you find yourself and what your particular gifts are. If you're a singer, you sing about it. If you're in a congregation, you work with others to build the congregation. If you're in government, you find where the pathways are there. But I think in all of those areas, you listen and you recognize that you're in a relationship, and a relationship that's just unilateral is not really a healthy relationship. And so, in a congregation, in an art setting, in a government setting, you try to find those voices and those people that they're speaking into that space. And then with that listening, you can participate, involve, receive invitations. There's so much to do after that pattern. And I think that's stronger in the end, rather than just having like, here's one way to do it. If we're all in our diffuse areas of life doing this, we build a much stronger set of possibilities. When I was a young boy, my mother would cook cookies and bread, and she'd put the flour and the baking soda and the salt and the sugar together. I just loved that process. But what I was most intrigued with was this little thing called yeast. And she said, look, if I put this little thing in the mix, it's going to cause the rest of it to be able to rise. And I took that to heart when I went through life, is that I don't have to be all things to all people at all times. Just need to be that little piece in that one place, and maybe something will rise in that area. And you in your other area have that influence there, and someone else in their other area. And I do think that that's the path of wisdom, because that builds a relationality that's, again, not coerced. It's not top down. It's not unilateral. We take our Christian traditions, or if we're Muslim or Buddhist, and we add that to the mix, or we take our different partisan orientations. People who are conservative can advance these issues in their way. People who are liberal or NDP can advance these issues in their way. We're a diverse set of people with different ideas about the world, and we want freedom, right? And freedom is this opportunity to correlate with the differences that we have, rather than just all become like automatons and cookie cutters of one another. And so I think that for me is the path to answering that question. Of course, I'd like to see constitutional recognition, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples passed. You can advocate for that. I think that would be a good thing. There are big goals that we can achieve together, like treaties in the particular area that you're a part of. But there's so much more. And the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were to all avenues of civil society, museums and businesses and childcare and healthcare and law schools and public schools. And I really liked that approach, that it wasn't just leaving it to government, but trying to speak to all sorts of civil society in the different ways that were put together.
I think one of the things that I think there's a lot of people, social media has really helped us to get things out. But at the same time, there's still a lot of people who don't understand that there is a need for them to offer their gifts and to bring support. So what do you think about that? Like, how do we actually get it out there to the people? I know this forum here is one way we're doing it. But, you know, I can write to people, but 1 out of 5 might respond. How do we get the ear of the people for them to realize the situation within our the First Nations communities, and that we need to start to deal with these things?
It's a great question. So, you know, people who are in business schools doing MBAs need to put their message out there in their way. I think art, like singing, is huge. Novels are really important. You know, I'm not on social media, and so I can't speak to influencers and how that work might be done in that space, but there's obviously a role there as well. For me, I think it's through gentleness and meekness and love unfeigned and patience and kindness and education and you know, the things that we're taught as Christians. We should be in the world living and trying to demonstrate that in the different spheres that we find ourselves. And I think that's more powerful than a tweet or even a piece of legislation. I don't want to downplay all of that. Tweets are important, legislation is important, but it has to have substance behind it, right? And I hope what we're talking about is the substance that's behind it. And then that's an invitation. Like, that's what our treaties are. They're an invitation to people that are coming to live amongst us, to learn of us, to learn of the beauty of the land, the plants, the rivers, the waters, the winds, the animals, the rocks. Walk with us, walk together, learn together, and you'll feel in your heart the beauty of that person, the needs that they might have, and the wonder of that bird's song and the incredible teachings that might lie there as the wolf calls out. I mean, you know, those are the things that motivate me. And I think people can be motivated by that, again, in their different spheres.
Yeah,
yeah. It almost brings it into this question here. It feels like the right moment. That broken treaties are a reality in Canada and represent profound breaking of trust and relationships and I struggle with that word, reciprocity. The deeply troubling examples in Mi'kmaq recently are sad, quite predictable under the circumstances. How is it possible to move towards love after such a long pattern of broken covenants? Where do you see hope?
Yeah. So one of the things I really appreciated when I learned from the Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan about their agreements, I sat with them for 3 years talking about the peace and order clauses in their agreements. And so many of those elders talked about when treaties were agreed to, they weren't just with Indigenous peoples in the Crown, although that was part of the agreement. They both lifted themselves up and they made a covenant with the Creator. And so, you know, there at that treaty site, you would have missionaries and they would be praying, and you would have Indigenous peoples with their medicine bundles and their pipes. And they pledged to the Creator that they would live together in peace and friendship and respect as long as the grass grows, the river flows, and the sun shines. So when a non-Indigenous person or government might break a treaty, or an Indigenous person might break a treaty, that's not the end of the treaty, because it's not just between those two parties who are mortal. The covenant is with the Creator, with the Great Spirit. And so just because your neighbor breaks a covenant with God does not mean that you break a covenant with God, is part of what I was hearing. And so what they tried to talk about is how we can understand what that covenant means. And they did so by teaching me about fire. Fire in Cree and Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, is Ode. Ishkode, Ishkode. Ishkode is the word for fire. The word for heart is ode. So they had all these analogies to fire and heart, that when a fire starts to dim, you need to add fuel to it. But you can't add too much fuel to it or it'll rage out of control and burn everything up that's around it. But when you tend to that fire properly, it provides warmth and heat and light, and it allows us to be able to cook and feast together. It provides a way of being together. So the elders, they didn't use the word repentance, but I understand the repentance process as being a fresh view of God and ourselves and others, a changing of a heart when we've broken some promise that we've made. And that is through a fresh view, through tending to one another's hearts, to tending to the brokenness, as Jonathan talked about, that ministry that was performed by his friend over years and years and years, feeding those people in the downtown east side. You don't need to be preaching aloud. You don't need to be very explicit about the things that you might be motivated by to do that work, but you're giving a person another meal for the night, or you're sitting beside them and talking with them, buoying them up. For me, that's what's required, returning to our covenants. Now, we're a secular country in our constitutional terms, and I think still this language can have value to us. Constitutions are regarded as binding because we give them deference. They have something that's beyond the everyday. You can't just amend a constitution by going to Parliament. There's this this convoluted process to make the change. In other words, there's something that's lifted up above the ordinary that we want to honor. And for some people, it can be a covenant with God that's lifted it up above the ordinary. And that's certainly what I heard from the elders. But it could also just be it's constitutional. And so it's lifted up above the day-to-day affairs of Parliament or the legislatures, because there's something in those agreements, something in those laws that calls us to our better selves, to build a society on persuasion and discussion and deliberation and listening to others' perspectives and others' languages and other ways of life. And that might not be sacred if you're non-religious, but it's going to be something that has a similar type of effect, which is we're not going to lightly change that. And we need to come back to that by the forces of recognition and sorrow and change that we might find in a religious tradition. You can argue those things in a more secular way of thinking as well.
There's some good questions. Like there's some real people that you've really got thinking out there, John. There's a question here: to what extent does each First Nation need to have a modern nation-to-nation agreement or a treaty with Canada, or are updated treaties not necessary?
I think having the specificity of language that the Parliament promises or the legislature promises really helps the Parliament and the legislature to be accountable to their own passage of laws. And so, to the extent that you have law through Parliament or legislature or treaties that are agreed to between levels of government and First Nations, that's a huge help, because otherwise you're just relying on
bringing clarity to it.
That's right. So it's a very helpful thing. But if it doesn't happen, we're not necessarily lost, right? We have lots of ways of living that we have a general principle, love your neighbor, and then you have to work on that general principle in a specific context. As long as you're that general principle. You can do the work without the specificity, but it helps to have that specificity too.
A follow-up in that question, I think it's kind of a little different. It's different, but would you please speak to the situation of a hereditary or traditional chief and elected chiefs when there is not agreement? How can I, as a settler, discern whom to support? What are questions we can ask to better understand?
That's an excellent point. And so one of the things that illustrates is that Indigenous peoples don't just disagree with the state, they also disagree with one another. Mm-hmm. What's happened in the past is all our disagreement was what's happened in the past is the way that we were taught to deal with disagreement was through the Indian Act. And yet our hereditary chiefs were always around and were a part of life. And now what we're seeing is that as the Indian Act is not regarded as the only way forward, these hereditary chiefs are coming to life again. Their laws are resurgent. They're being revitalized. And so part of what has to happen for Indigenous peoples is that we need to see that Indian Act sort of fade in its significance, maybe even be repealed or other pathways. But that doesn't mean that we're suddenly going to have a group hug with one another as Indigenous peoples. We're still going to have disagreements. And what we need the revitalization of is our ability not just to be free from other impositions from other Canadians, we need to be free to be different from one another as Indigenous peoples. It's often thought, well, they're all the same. That's what the Mohawks do, or that's what the Ojibwe do. But no, in fact, we have as many different opinions as other people do in other walks of life. And so part of what I'm involved with is trying to revitalize our own Indigenous legal traditions so that we can be able to disagree with one another agreeably, right? Find disagreement as a part of our society and have tribal courts or feast structures or potlatching structures or administrative tribunals or restorative justice circles, right? Whatever our different traditions will take on, we can not solve those problems, discuss with one another what our differences are so that in the moment you can find that we shade in this direction or we shade in that direction. There can be some authoritative voice that comes forward before we run off in 50 different directions again, before the next dispute comes along. In other words, we're just like municipalities or church congregations or unions or provinces or federal governments. We have had, that's why we have law as Indigenous peoples, have disputes, and law is there to answer those. So as a settler, what I think the best kind of support could be is the kind of support that would recognize our differences from one another within our communities and then argue for legal processes revitalized within those communities so that we can argue and yell and talk with one another, try to persuade and deliberate and come to the resolutions in that way.
Okay, I have another question here. Would you please say more about the treaties how the treaties bridged legal systems and the interconnectedness of the nations? Okay. And did legal traditions merge to create a nation, or was it the result of the treaty processes, nations committed to living in peace and friendship?
Yeah, so you can interpret what the consequences of treaties are in different ways. But let me say that when, say, my great-great-grandpa came to the treaty negotiating event, he brought his language, he brought his understanding of the 7 grandmother-grandfather teachings, his clan responsibilities, the stories that were told to him by his partner and by the generations in the past. And all of that framework there sat in his mind, and he thought, am I going to accept this treaty or not? And he's judging whether or not to enter into that treaty by his own laws. And the Crown is doing the same thing, right? The Crown is coming to the treaty negotiation and they're thinking, okay, what's in the common law about contract? What are the principles of agreement? What might be the remedies if we disagree here? And so that person's bringing that. They're both coming with these legal worldviews. But what the treaty required is this dialogue where they would share back and forth, and so that the lands would be reserved to the Indians. That requires recognition of some of those instances where our laws would continue to speak to how we would govern ourselves in that site. And then another part of the treaty negotiation would be the settlers would pick up the land for the purposes of agriculture. And so you would have that enter into the agreement there as well. So what came out of that negotiation wasn't just Anishinaabe law, no, nor was it just common law, no. A morally and politically defensible conception of what was agreed to there would have to incorporate both legal perspectives. Otherwise, you wouldn't have an agreement. But the agreement itself presumes that you're trying to find ways to address one another's interests and ideas. And of course, there could be imbalances of power in doing that. But that imbalance of power does not take away for a moment the notion of the agreement being the product of two different legal systems encountering one another, and then and expressing an agreement that flows from those two different legal systems involvement. And so those wampum belts there that are behind Jonathan just really visually illustrate that, right? With the white and the purple rose, or the people joining their arms together, or the little diamonds that are up and down the belt itself. These are treaties that the Crown entered into, but look what they look like. They're not just words on a page, they're actually figures sewn into hide. And likewise, people would have walked away not just with a document of the written word or a document of the wampum, they would have, in their minds and in their hearts, would have walked away with, oh, I see something here of the English way, I'd like that. And that became a part of the treaty, just like when my great-great-great-grandpa converted to Methodism. But likewise, the Crown saw something in the land. They saw something in the need to be able to sit with the pipes, with the medicine bundles, hear these great long speeches. And the wording of the document can't often be trusted because it's only evidence of a much more complicated set of things that was going on in that instance. And you can't just take the written word as the be all and end all of what was put together in that process. So I think, in my view, these treaties created Canada in my traditional territory. Other people will have a different view, but that's the view I hold. Canada wouldn't be there on the Saugeen Peninsula without us. It's what we've done together.
Wow, it's so inspiring when you think about it. Is it my turn, Sarah? Yeah, there's a question here that's really, I mean, it's so current. There has been an ongoing strife around Caledonia when development encroached on the land around the Grand River that were awarded to the Six Nations. The court recently supported the developers. How do you see that path going forward? And when we were talking with Alan, I guess they're down to 5% of the original treaty, of the original promise. They're trying to defend 5% of what's left of what the promise was. What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I've tried to write about this in different points of time. My feeling is that people need to learn more about that dispute. If you're aware of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's history, they agreed to come to that area and settle on the Grand River in a promise that they were allies with the Crown, not subjects of the Crown. And in that alliance process, it was promised to them by deed and grant that they would hold that land forever. What occurred is one of the chiefs, Joseph Brant, acted to alienate some of that land, and other chiefs disagreed with that, but the Crown often sided with what Joseph Brant did. But in doing so, that's a siding with a chief that breaks the promises that was given to the entire Confederacy. When the Confederacy got vocal about this, what the Crown did is they came into the council hall and they took all the wampums that people would use to convene in their ancient constitutional structure to undertake their business. And all those wampums were taken out of the council hall, and then the council hall was boarded up by the RCMP, and an elected council was put in. And those elected councils, I have every faith in the good intentions of people that are serving on those councils, but often you get maybe out of a population of 25,000 Haudenosaunee at Six Nations, perhaps 300-400, maybe 800 people voting for the Indian Act process. Most people, many people anyways, regard that as an imposition, not their free and informed choice as peoples of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, with the clan mothers and the Constitution that takes 7 days to be able to recite orally when you gather together. And then they go off to the United Nations, they skahe, and he makes speeches at the United Nations saying, we fought with you in these great wars as allies with you, not just the Revolutionary War, but also the world wars of World War I and II, etc. And yet you're not listening to us as part of the nations of the earth. I would hope one day people would look at the Caledonia history in the light of that longer sweep of history and recognize that what those people that are doing there in that Caledonia site is trying to hold the British to their highest standards of law, which is you promise something, you're not living by those promises. And they're also trying to uphold their own law as a Haudenosaunee people there as well. And I know there's disagreement amongst the Haudenosaunee about how to best deal with the Caledonia issue, but then they have their own systems that could be revitalized. Just as I talked about a second ago, it doesn't necessarily have to be through the Indian Act. It might not even just be through the counseling process of that great law of peace, but it could be something that is more productive than just the way it's being treated with right now. So I hope that's an answer. We're operating with shorthand and very short memories. And that doesn't produce, I think, the justice that we all long for, which is a resolution that speaks not just to our minds, but also to our hearts. And I think we've got some work to do to try to bring that history and that longer sweep of holding Canadian law up to its higher standards, as well as Indigenous law.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for spending the time with us this evening. And we hope that you're encouraged in your studies and your teaching.
Thank you.
Well, the work that you have been called to is very significant. It's not small work, and it is really needed now. So we thank God for your gifts, and we ask His continued blessing upon you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I also want to say thank you to our audience for joining us. Many of you attended all of the sessions so far. So we thank you for being with us in this Walking Together conference. And if you have missed any of the sessions, with the permission of our presenters, we have recorded them. And you can access the recordings. They're posted at the Canada Baptist Church website, or we can email the link to you. So I'll quickly go over what's next week, and then we'll wrap things up. So next week, we'll have a special week with plenty of singing and storytelling and plenty of Jonathan. We'll reflect upon what we have learned, and we'll think about where we are headed. We'll give thanks for the good land that we all share as treaty people, and we'll give God all the praise. So join us next Wednesday. Jonathan, will you close us now with a song and a prayer?
I'll do that. Thank you very much, Sarah. It's been great working with you again tonight. And
You as well.
yeah, it's John, it's just, I feel so blessed. I don't know how to, I really can't put it into words. You've really brought what you've done in my heart. And I say this as humbly as I can, but you've confirmed a whole bunch of things in my own heart, in that I can be stronger about my approach because of the words that you've spoken tonight. And you know, when I write a song, I don't have to beat around the bush, you know. Like let's jump in that bush and cut it down if we have to, you know. But let's get this thing opening up. And I'm so honored to have heard the things that you brought. And I know that our audience out there, all of you guys that are out there that have been listening tonight, ladies and gentlemen and young people, elders, all of you, we're so thankful that you took the time to be with us tonight. And to hear the quality of what we've just heard, we are really blessed, truly blessed to have had this time with you, John. I just hope that this isn't the last time that we get to speak with you. We're kind of tossing around the idea of maybe doing this again in midwinter, like around late January, February, and maybe, you know, and in the meantime, you know, promoting what's taken place from this. But I'd be thrilled to be able to spend more time with you. In person would be great, but this has been really cool. I mean, thank you, Zoom, right? Yeah. So in all that, yeah, so let's see. During the last month, we've gathered together from all across Canada, from all around the world, actually. There's been people who have come in from European nations and different places to be a part of this gathering. And more than 400 people registered. I think it's probably over 500 now for our presenters, and it's all been good. We're going to try and make next week when I do the concert, I'm going to, you know, summarize some of the stuff and bring back to memory some of the things that happened over this time, but hopefully do it through music. I'm going to open it up and have some questions and answers and just really try and do it through music, do the next level through music and storytelling. So we're even going to try and get our Zoom technology to actually let us see the whole audience. We're working on that so that we can have one picture and just see all the pictures of everybody from everywhere. So we're trying to make that come together. So, you know, I had two different songs that I was going to play to end up tonight, but it's all come around to this one word, and that word is love. And I want to sing a song that I wrote some years ago, but the song is called Ganaronkwa. And I would play my drum, but my guitar seems to work a little better for me tonight. So Jesus, Ganaronkwa. Jesus, Ganaronkwa. Jesus, Ganaronkwa. Jesus, Ganaronkwa. Jesus, Yahweh, Ganaronkwa. Jesus, Yahweh, Ganaronkwa. I said, Jesus is good medicine, Ganaronkwa. I said, Jesus is good medicine, Ganaronkwa. Yes, oh. Ganodonkwa, Yahweh, Jesus, Yahweh, Ganodonkwa, Jesus, Yahweh, Ganodonkwa. I said, Jesus is good medicine, Ganodonkwa. I said, Jesus is good medicine, Ganodonkwa. Jesus, Ganodonkwa, Yahweh, Jesus, Ganodonkwa, Yahweh, Jesus, Yahweh, Ganodonkwa. Jesus, Yahweh, Ganodonkwa. I said, Jesus is good medicine, Ganodonkwa. Oh, I said, Jesus is good medicine, Ganodonkwa. Jesus is good medicine, Ganodonkwa. 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 Jesus is the medicine that heals the world. Woo! I just want to pray and just finish up here. One statement you said was, we need to be able to be free to be different. And the whole thing tonight was about being able to marry the different people together, being able to have the one culture use its rules and laws, but being sensitive to the rules and laws of the other culture, and for them to be able to merge and be able to grow together and respect one another. It's all about honor. Really, if we can honor one another, then we can find that common ground for us to be able to merge. So I just like to pray and close us out tonight and say thank you so much once again. And thank you, studio audience. Thank you, all of you who are out there that have come from everywhere to be a part of this tonight. So let's just get ourselves in that place right now where we can thank the Creator for the good thing that He's brought us. So, Holy Spirit, Sungwaya Diso, He who holds the heavens, we honor you tonight. We give you thanks. We give you thanks for the fine words that we've been able to hear. I pray that once again we have been able to receive those words into our spirit, and that we will be able to recall those words and retain those words that will help us to grow. You know, the old saying was that my old grandmother said was, eat the meat and throw away the bones. But I think we got a lot of meat tonight. And Lord, I just thank you that you have gifted John with such an amazing ability to bring understanding to what the power of love really is. And so, Lord, I pray that you would bind us all together with cords of love, that you would open our eyes so that we could see into each other's situations and be able to accept one another. Teach us how to walk the path together. Teach us how to learn how to walk together so that we can fulfill the mandate of this particular gathering. But the cry in the hearts of people like John, in the hearts of people like Sarah and myself, and the people who have organized and put this together, our heart is that we would take time to listen to one another. So Lord, empower us to be able to draw like your love draws people. Your word draws people. And I just pray that you would just draw people so that we can teach them and we can grow together. I thank you, Lord, for your goodness. I thank you that the technology worked smoothly tonight. And I pray that the songs were received and the words were received in a good way. So I say, Nyawe Goa, goodbye, but just for now until we return. And I hope you will all come and be with us next week on Wednesday when we do one more for the finale. And I'll be playing many songs and we'll be talking about some of these things. I may even open for question. So thank you, John. Thank you, Sarah, Jim, studio, or the audience. Thank you for coming out tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time. And you know, we're thinking about doing it again. So if you want to send us some messages and that you want to be, that you think that it's something that we should follow up with, and we would love to hear from you. And I'll say again, thank you very much. God bless you. Ona Gate Wahi.